Can we push Trump now to do the right thing?
You said that brutality has made some Arab Gulf states view Israel as a bigger threat than Iran.
If I were Kareem Khan, I would charge Trump. Israel has become a pariah state. To look to Trump as a solution to an awful human rights problem, that's the world we're in. But I don't think it's an impossible situation.
As of course you know, it's the second biggest weapons supplier to Israel after the US.
Where I really tried to take on all the Israeli defenses. We see, a number of governments that are increasingly willing to sanction Israeli officials. But Netanyahu basically banks on Christian evangelicals.
64% of Israelis see no need for more reporting on Palestinians in Gaza and believe, quote, there are no innocent people in Gaza. Welcome back to Out Loud, where we speak to people who challenge the status quo and say the quiet part out loud. Today's guest has spent a lifetime doing just that. Kenneth Roth led Human Rights Watch for nearly 3 decades, exposing injustice in some of the darkest corners of the world. He's the author of The Economist's Best Books of 2025, or one of the books, I should say. Ken, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to join you.
I was curious. I've heard, and I know your father fled Nazi Germany.
Yes.
I know that's a legacy that you've already said shaped your views, of the world from a young age.
My father fled Nazi Germany in July 1938 as a 12-year-old boy and got to New York. It was a very difficult process because it took my grandfather 5 years. He knew as soon as Hitler took power that he'd have to get out. It was very difficult to find some place that would take Jews. And so the family actually split up and made it in kind of tranches, but ultimately got there. And so I grew up with Hitler stories. And it actually happened. My father would cut the hair of me and my brothers. And to keep us quiet as he did that, he would tell us stories about Nazi Germany. And, at first they were actually funny stories about the horse that delivered meat from my grandfather's butcher shop. But, as we got older, it became more serious. And that was very formative for me. It made it clear, the evil that governments could do. And it was a big part of why, once I went to law school, or in fact, really part of why I went to law school, I wanted to address these kind of injustices and try to prevent similar ones from happening to anybody.
It's even when you said that he started with humor or jokes when you were younger, humor is such a useful and survival tool for so many. I can relate to that just from the Palestinians I speak to who are enduring what's happening there, the genocide. So, but let's keep it to Germany for a second, if we will, since we started with that. As of course you know, it's the second biggest weapons supplier to Israel after the US, and yet somehow I'm perplexed, Ken. Maybe you can deconstruct this for me. A majority of Germans, I think 73%, now want tighter restrictions or even a total ban on arms to Israel. So why is there then this huge disconnect between public conscience and policy in Germany, but it's also true in so many European countries, and particularly in the US? I mean, Germany and the US are the two biggest, arms providers for Israel. But do you think Germany is waking up, or is this about rebranding? I mean, what's happening? Is there a shift?
Yeah. Well, first, Ahmed, I think it's worth noting that in the rest of Europe, there is a shift going on. Macron's leading this, but we see, a number of governments that are increasingly willing to sanction Israeli officials. They're talking about, suspending the EU-Israel trade agreement. So there is a significant movement. You could say belated, but nonetheless, finally waking up to the awful reality of Gaza. In Germany, they have something called the Staatsräson, or the raison d'etat, the reason of the state, which is understandable at a certain level. They want to make amends for the Holocaust. Fair enough. Sadly, the way they have interpreted that is rather than, defend the Jews and frankly defend the human rights standards that would protect Jews and others from further atrocities, they have instead decided to defend the Israeli government, even when that government is ripping up the Geneva Conventions, is ripping up the standards that actually safeguard Jews. And I think a very good case can be made that Germany is harming Jews by, by just unconditionally backing the Netanyahu government. So, I've spoken about this in Germany. I've written about it. It is not a common position there. In fact, you get considerable censorship when you try to pick this up. I have not personally faced that. I've been able to speak, but a lot of people have said it's amazing that you can say this because most people can't. So that I think is a lot of what's going on with Germany. There is broad recognition that they've misinterpreted their Staatsräson, and they've
Mhm.
focused back on the right standards that might have helped to deter the Holocaust rather than just blindly following Netanyahu. Now, in the US, I think it's actually something different because the the Jewish population in the United States mostly
Mhm.
votes Democratic. They
Mhm.
mostly are rights oriented. They
Mhm.
are not thrilled with what Netanyahu is doing. Many, many Jews have turned on the Israeli government because of the atrocities
Mhm.
in Gaza. But Netanyahu long ago has given up on American Jews. With the
Mhm.
exception of APAC, which is this ultra conservative representative of one tiny segment of the Jewish population. But Netanyahu basically banks on Christian evangelicals, which is odd. But the Christian evangelicals believe in Israel as a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. And
Mhm.
therefore, they just back Israel. And these are the people who vote Republican. This is Trump's base. And so, that is at this point the major reason why the US just keeps supporting Israel. Right? I think one interesting thing to explore, Ahmed, is
Mhm.
could that change now? Because we've
Mm.
seen Trump turn on Netanyahu in a series of recent developments. So, he's negotiating with Iran rather than bombing it.
True.
He lifted the sanctions on Syria when Netanyahu didn't want that to happen. He cut a deal with the Houthis that did not involve any promise to refrain from targeting Israel. Visited the Middle East and didn't visit Israel. So he imposed the initial ceasefire back in January. He's pushing now, kind of inadequately for some food to go in to break the siege. So there are a number of places where he's kind of at loggerheads with Netanyahu. I think the interesting question is, can we push Trump now to do the right thing? To condition the arms sales, to condition the military aid.
And obviously, forgive me for interjecting, but like what comes to mind is it doesn't necessarily need to be for altruistic or human rights reasons, right? Trump is a transactional guy, and the same way a lot of Republicans shifted on climate change once renewable energy became profitable. Like, does it matter, in your opinion, if the reason Trump might abandon the long-held, defense of all Israeli crimes, impunity, occupation? The reason behind why he might do that, or does that matter less
It,
than
it,
just him doing it?
it doesn't matter. And in fact, one point I make in my book is that when we put pressure on governments, we are not trying to perform some personal conversion. We're not trying to make dictators into nice guys. We're trying
Right.
to change the cost benefit analysis of oppression. And so if
Mhm.
you take Trump, if you go to him and say, why are you supporting this government that is ripping up human rights treaties? He would say, well, what are those?
Mhm.
But you have to kind of play with Trump's aspirations. And in this case, he sees himself as a grand negotiator, the art of the
Yeah.
deal. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize for coming up with some grand, Israeli Palestinian peace. Great. I'm glad for that. It gives us something to work with. And now we have to
Yeah.
show that he's not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize through mass ethnic cleansing. He's going to get it by,
Right.
stopping the bombing and starving of Palestinian civilians and pushing for a Palestinian state.
Right. And because you brought up the evangelical Christians, I often find myself in conversations with people about, just how many Christian Zionists exist, let alone back genocide in the US. And that the way that they're doing it in the early days, I remember there being a lot of confusion and also outrage when Netanyahu was explicitly using sort of biblical verses and tribes like Amalek to justify the extermination of Palestinians. This was even before saying, "Oh, there's no such thing as an innocent civilian." But it seems that is, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get side noted, but I just thought of that, and because you bring up your book, I want to talk to you about your book specifically. Something I know that many people might be needing to hear, that there's always a way, you say, to shift the calculus of governments, right? That repression, as you just mentioned, isn't cost free. So when we talk about Gaza, where we've seen schools, hospitals bombed, more journalists than ever, over 215 now journalists murdered. I mean, just all the violations and in broad daylight, day after day. What's the angle? I mean, how do you raise the cost of complicity there? And where can we find hope that it is
Yeah.
possible?
Well, Ahmed, I mean, I think you're right about that's a main takeaway from my book. In that, if you're a human rights defender, you actually cannot afford to just despair. Yes, terrible things happen, but you always have to look at a situation and figure out what's the angle. And there's always something, there's always some form of leverage. There's something that the abusive
Mhm.
government cares about that you can try to deprive them of until their behavior improves. So, and the book runs through a bunch of examples of that. That's, the book about. Now, in terms of, Netanyahu, he at this stage is really depending on a constituency of one, which is Trump.
Mhm.
Okay, because he's lost Europe, he's lost the rest of the world. And as long as Trump keeps the arms and the military aid going, as long as Trump vetoes Security Council resolutions,
Mhm.
I think Netanyahu feels that he can keep going with his genocidal plans. So, but that's kind of a dangerous position for Netanyahu to be in because Trump is not a principled believer in Israel. Trump isn't a principled believer in anything other than himself, and so it is possible, to affect Trump to make him realize that it's not in his self interest to continue this unconditional support.
Forgive me, Ken. As you're speaking, Miriam Adelson and APAC, which you referenced earlier, comes to mind. I mean, is it, do you think these sorts of calculations, given how transactional he is, I mean, do you think that somehow, is that overcomable, how beholden he may be to them, or not?
Look, I mean, at this point, sure, he likes contributions from wealthy pro Israel people, but he's not running for anything anymore. So
Yeah.
I actually think he's looking for different things. He wants his presidency to be a success. He wants to have a positive legacy. I think that's why when he just visited the Gulf, he was just so close with, the Saudi and the Emirati leaders
Hmm.
and, was willing to listen to them when it came to lifting sanctions on Syria, something Netanyahu didn't want. The question is, will they be strong advocates for an end to the atrocities in Gaza and movement toward a Palestinian state? Now, I actually have very little faith in Mohammed bin Salman. I think he could care less about Palestinians. But the Saudi people have been watching Al Jazeera. They are outraged by what's happening in Gaza. And even, a monarch
True.
cannot afford to be indifferent to public opinion. So I think that one way to look at this is that Trump wants Saudi and Emirati money. So he listens to these people. He admires them as autocrats. And that is, one route for him to recognize that if he wants this grand deal, if he wants the Abraham Accords to extend to Saudi Arabia, he's going to have to get Netanyahu to make some concessions. And if Trump pushes him, there's nobody to the right of Trump. So
Hmm.
Netanyahu could ignore Biden because there was the whole Republican Party that actually supported him. But Trump
Hmm.
owns the Republican Party now. There's nobody to the
Hmm.
right. If Trump turns, Netanyahu has to turn. And that I think has got to be our strategy now. It's not, it's odd, it's ironic to look to Trump as a solution to an awful human rights problem. That's the world we're in, but I don't think it's an impossible situation.
I appreciate you framing it as that. And I guess this question is sort of informed by my own kind of confrontation throughout my career as a journalist with having to pay some sacrifice as a result of just speaking out on Palestine. I think we've seen in so many different industries, people with large followings or under the, in the public eye have been very reluctant, even if their personal views may be, against the genocide. And I've started to see even a shift with like people like Gochi, these sort of at the BET Awards, linking what's happening in the US and Los Angeles when it comes to the protests against ICE, linking the systems of oppression there in the US with what's happening in Israel. And I guess what I want to know from you is, you were initially denied a fellowship at Harvard, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world, of course, but also one of the ones that has been targeted by the US administration. Maybe they're making better decisions than Columbia, but this was obviously done because of your criticism of Israel, your consistent criticisms. It took sort of a public outcry and a protest to eventually reverse that decision, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm wondering, like, what did that on a personal level reveal to you, not just about the limits of sort of free speech, academic freedom, but about sort of the deep fear in confronting Israeli actions, abuses, aggression, occupation, ethnic cleansing, just the myriad of crimes. And how deep does that run in liberal institutions in this moment?
Well, I mean, my situation at Harvard, which came really after I left Human Rights Watch, just afterwards,
Mhm.
wasn't that different from what I've experienced at Human Rights Watch. I'd always already had to deal with this. So it was clear to me from early on you couldn't be a credible human rights organization if you had made an exception for Israel. So we had to hold Israel to the same standards as everybody else,
Right.
and including, spotlighting their war crimes. And the thing that I did that was probably most controversial when I was there was, I signed off on a report saying this is apartheid,
Hmm.
referring to the occupied territories. And
Yep.
what I learned over the years, though, is that while I would inevitably be attacked for any time I criticized Israel, that the people who supported Human Rights Watch believed in the principles,
Hmm.
including, the many Jewish supporters of Human Rights Watch. So, I didn't lose donors. I would be beaten up by, the right wing media, but who cares? And I learned to live with it. And I learned that this is just what I have to do to head a credible human rights organization. Now, when I announced that I was leaving Human Rights Watch, I was approached by the Harvard Kennedy School, their human rights program, to say, would I like to work on the book that I said I was going to write there? And we talked about it. I said, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. So, and I just, assumed that this would happen. It was a human rights fellowship. I must be qualified for that. But, I had a conversation with the dean just beforehand, and it was a perfectly pleasant conversation until the end. He said, do you have any enemies? I
Mm.
said, well, yes, that's the hazard of the trade.
No, no, I've been a human rights defender, a leading a leading human rights defender for 30 years. I have
Yeah.
no end.
Yeah, so and I mentioned I'd been personally sanctioned by the Chinese and the Russians, and the
Right.
Saudis hate me, and the Rwandans hate me, but I knew what he was driving at. I say, "Yeah, the Israelis are not so fond of me either." And 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from my friends at the Kennedy School saying, "He vetoed your fellowship." So, I mean, I couldn't believe this.
Yeah.
And it was explicitly because of the criticism of Israel.
Yeah.
So,
And the fear, right? Is it a fear? I mean, there's all these conspiracy theories. I don't want to give them any room for it, but I don't want to go down that road. But like, how can there be such a comprehensive fear, anxiety, suppression across so many different industries
well,
and so many different
I mean,
geographies?
what everybody speculated is that he was worried about donors. I think that
Hmm.
was crazy, I mean, but and he, in fact, denied having spoken to any donor, but he said he spoke to people who mattered to him, which is probably
Hmm.
his fundraising department.
Hmm.
But he just completely miscalculated. And
Hmm.
and once this became public, there were 2 weeks of massive media exposure and criticism and protests at Harvard. And finally, he called an emergency faculty meeting, and everybody opposed what he had done. Everybody said I should be given the fellowship. So he changed his mind. And so, I mean, I didn't, have any personal price that I paid to this in the end, but I then went to him and I went to the current president of Harvard, who was then the provost, and I said, "Look, I have a certain profile. I can mount this campaign to get this reversed, but most students, most academics can't do that. Would you reinforce that Harvard upholds academic freedom, even in the context of Israel and Palestine?" And neither one of them would do it.
Hmm.
So that, and that's why, Harvard is finally doing the right thing right now by standing up to Trump. But Harvard, does not have a stellar record up until this
Interesting. I mean, because you bring up that, I have so many things I want to talk about, but I have to, as a former student at Columbia who studied journalism there, about 15, 20 years ago, I guess now, I also taught there briefly. I was really personally disappointed, is obviously an understatement, but I couldn't believe the decisions, as you said, the miscalculations that Columbia and so many other universities have been making. Do you see this as repairable? I mean, to me, I don't know if it's emotionally driven, but it feels like those miscalculations, if enough people make them, I mean, it can actually take away some really fundamental freedoms, protections from not just authoritarianism and Trump, but even worse in the US, you know?
No, I think
Are you as concerned as an academic?
no, I'm very concerned. I mean, what Columbia did, which to try to appease Trump, and you see this with some of the big law firms that did the same thing. You see with CBS, some of the media outlets that have also tried to compromise with Trump. But that completely misunderstands how a bully operates. If you
Mhm,
try to make peace with a bully, they see it as a sign of weakness and they go for more. And so
mhm,
none of these have worked. Columbia doesn't have its grants back. It still is being targeted by the Trump administration.
right.
The only way to respond to a bully is by standing up to them and ideally doing it collectively. Trump is trying to proceed one by one, pick people off one by one. And the best response is a collective response. So the
Mhm,
university should get together, law firms should get together. And we are seeing that. I mean, I think there is a movement in that direction. Columbia, we have to recognize, is basically headless. I mean, if Lee Bollinger, the longtime president, had been there, he would never have allowed this. but they've had, first a brand new president, now a couple of interim presidents. They just,
Yeah.
there's no leadership there,
Yeah.
and they're making the
And
wrong decisions.
yeah, no, that's definitely clear. Well, I mean, I don't want to get into geopolitics because I worry about a downward spiral, but it feels inevitable, especially because I read a tweet of yours or a post on X, I should say, that sort of made me stop for a second. I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm curious for you to expand. You wrote that Israel's brutality, and I often say, they've done more for the Palestinian cause in this genocide than many others just by doing what they're doing and doing it so belligerently. But you said that brutality has made some Arab Gulf states view Israel as a bigger threat than Iran. I've seen the UK and the Canadian governments now sanction far-right Israeli ministers. What are you basing that on? Is that true in your mind?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting article by Vali Nasser in Foreign Affairs that makes this case,
Hmm.
and I think the evidence that we're seeing of this is that the Arab Gulf states have are actively encouraging negotiation with Iran. They want to contain its nuclear program not by bombing it, but by negotiating it away. And Netanyahu wants the opposite. And then, you see Netanyahu not only crushing Palestinian civilians in Gaza, but doing, the same thing in southern Lebanon, doing the same thing in parts of Syria right now. I mean, they really are, in a sense, uninhibited in their use of military power throughout the region.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, while the UAE has not, denormalized its relations with Israel, there clearly is a bit of buyer's remorse there. They're not, jumping in to say, "Oh, we'll help rebuild Gaza," when there's
Hmm.
no path to a Palestinian state. The Saudis have similarly made clear there won't be normalization without a path to a Palestinian state. So, I mean, I just think, and this may be partly a product of just, Saudi vulnerability in particular, when they realize that they're, when a few years ago there were those attacks on its oil facilities and there was nothing that anybody did. I think they
Hmm.
recognize that this belligerence toward Iran is not necessarily the best route,
Right.
that they can negotiate there. But what's the obstacle to negotiation right now? It's Israel. So I just think that there is a kind of a reassessment of where
Mm.
the Arab Gulf states stand in this conflict between Iran and Israel.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's undeniable. That's interesting to think of. In the international context of all this, international law context, I should say, obviously, I'm not an expert. I do and have had the pleasure of speaking with some experts, people of course, like Francesca Albanese and others. And I always come to this sort of question, which is, of course, international law is meant to prevent this kind of horror. Of course, I know and understand that states have obligations under treaties, under international law to prevent genocide rather than what a lot of the mainstream media suggests, which is like, no, but Israel's saying it's not genocide, it's going to take years until we know, let's wait. Obviously we can't wait years until the genocide's complete, but that coupled with the US openly violating not just Article 70 of the Rome Statute but so many others, by sanctioning the ICC officials. I mean, these new sanctions on the prosecutor, on the judges, anyone involved, for not only investigating Netanyahu, Gallant, but even US torture in Afghanistan. I mean, with Karim Khan on leave, are we witnessing the collapse of the ICC? Is that overstated? I mean, how can there be accountability when all the mechanisms, both domestically and internationally, this top court seem to be not just under attack, but almost paralyzed? Am I over?
I think you're overstating that. In other words,
Okay, good,
um,
good. That's what I want to
yeah,
hear.
I think the ICC actually, is look at it. It is a very slow institution. It's accomplished much less than they would have wanted to over the years.
Hmm.
But it's on a positive trajectory right now because a few years ago it was only charging sub-Saharan Africans, and
Hmm.
now it has moved on elsewhere. So it's charged Netanyahu and Gallant, it's charged Putin and four Russian generals. Duterte, the former Philippine president, is in custody. There is a request for arrest warrants for the Myanmar junta leader, for the Taliban leaders in Afghanistan. So it's actually taking on big cases. But what you
Hmm.
describe, Trump's sanctions are utterly outrageous. And just to sort of fill in, the listeners here, Article 70 of the Rome Statute, which you mentioned, um,
Hmm.
criminalizes obstruction of justice. That is to say, threatening or intimidating a court officer because of their duties. That's exactly what Trump did. Now, if I were Kareem Khan, I would charge Trump.
Hmm.
I think that again, you got to stand up to the bully. If you just acquiesce, they're going to bully you some more. So I think that that's the right response. But the difficulty we have is that the ICC is headless. Kareem Khan is on leave because of sexual harassment allegations. There are,
Mhm.
two deputies running things, but, will a deputy take a difficult decision like that? Probably not.
Right.
The
Right.
deputies are also looking at charges against, the two far right Israeli ministers, Ben Giver and Smotrich, for I think for inciting settler violence in the West Bank.
Yeah.
Will
Yeah.
they take that final decision without the head there? So I don't know. I mean, I think we are at a bit of a problematic moment, and I hope that these charges against Khan are resolved one way or the other quickly, and
Yeah.
then he either continues or resigns. But that this interim phase is really not good for the institution.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of Trump, when he calls these peaceful protests that we're witnessing insurrection, when he deploys the National Guard, even the Marines, to suppress dissent. I mean, I know, having followed your work, and also just your Twitter account alone, I mean, you've warned very directly for years about Trump's autocratic tactics, the stacking of the courts, the silencing of dissent, attacking just sort of moral norms, right, cultural norms even. What kind of precedent do you think he's setting? Is it deliberate? I mean, is the US, and again, forgive me for overstating perhaps, but many people do believe it's already well on its way towards, at least in this moment under this administration, authoritarianism. I mean, not in design, but in
Yeah.
practice.
Well, let me qualify that a bit, Ahmed. I think that's what Trump wants to do. He has not
Hmm.
succeeded yet. So what he's doing is he's following the autocrat's handbook, and he is undercutting the various checks and balances on executive power. And so,
Hmm.
that was behind the attack on Harvard and the universities, because these are centers of independent thought. That's behind the attacks on journalists, the threats against judges, the threats against law firms so they don't bring suits against him. He's been talking about denying civil society their tax exempt status. And this deployment of the military is an effort to suppress protests, another important check on him. So this is all consistent. Now, the good news is that the U.S. democratic system is strong. The checks and balances are strong. Many people are
Hmm.
pushing back. I actually think that Trump's momentum has stalled. That I had a piece in the Guardian a week ago, saying,
Hmm.
"Have we reached peak Trump?" And I think we might have,
Yeah.
but he can still do a lot of damage, and I think
Hmm.
that's the way to understand this. I mean, he was gunning for this battle in Los Angeles, and it was a
But
it,
the,
it was
but that's exactly it, right? He wants the protesters to react violently because not only does that distract from sort of what's happening more broadly, but it will help him justify further encroachment or like
exactly.
using the net.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you just, the handful of violent people that are like magnified on
Mhm.
social media, and then that becomes, the image that his far right base has. So, this is a dangerous moment. And there are reasons why there are laws and traditions against deploying the military for
Mhm.
domestic policing purposes in the United States. I mean, if for no other reason than the military is trained to shoot combatants in war, not to use lethal force as a last resort when absolutely necessary, which is what policing standards are. So, this is a dangerous moment. What's interesting is that, Trump has this big military parade planned for Saturday, also his 79th birthday,
Yeah.
in Washington. And already he's threatening people, saying, if you protest, he doesn't even see if you protest violently, just if you protest, you will be met by very heavy force. So he is, just flouting these basic
Mhm.
standards, the First Amendment of the
Mhm.
US Constitution.
Mhm.
So, I mean, this is dangerous, but there is very significant pushback. So, while I think that Trump would like to be an autocrat, he's not
Mhm.
there yet. And I don't think we should, say that he is, because that I think almost, demoralizes and undercuts the resistance, when I think the resistance in many cases is working.
Interesting. When I look at Gaza today, when I watch the footage, when I speak to people there, sometimes hope can seem inaccessible or, fleeting at best. I mean, you've spent your life insisting in so many contexts like Gaza, and even I guess that justice is still possible. So many people on the ground in Gaza for so long were holding on to hope for the flotilla, and then Israel goes and bombs an aid flotilla, and then the next one they intercepted and abduct. Yeah, I mean, all these violations, and it seems like hope is maybe not as it always springs eternal, but it's not as accessible to many people in Gaza. Is there something that you can share about what keeps you hopeful that justice is still possible?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't want to minimize the plight of the people in Gaza. This is a horrible situation. And so, to say that I'm hopeful is not to deny
I
the
understand,
ugly,
and I appreciate that.
and I also, while I'd like to see justice, actually, that's not my top priority right now. The top priority is stopping the bombing and stopping the
Mhm,
situation. So we have to
mhm,
take, step by step. So I think, I do think that because it is just so outrageous what Israel's doing, and here they're now suddenly, breaking this an almost 3 month siege, going
mhm,
in drips and drabs of aid to a
mhm.
handful of distribution points, and then they shoot people who show up. I mean, this is just like so outrageous.
But that's what's crazy to me, Ken, sorry to interrupt. It's like, how do we tear through the narrative that somehow contains just how outrageous that is? Do you know what I mean? It's like people are almost, I mean, this isn't a broad representation of human society, but I scroll through Instagram and TikTok sometimes and I see people like at least saying that they feel like they're going insane. People who are invested in the cause for whatever reason, just because of how disconnected reality on the ground and what Israel's doing is from the narrative in the media and the political establishment, even still, even with European leaders taking these small steps to renegotiate future trade deals or what have you.
No, look, it is. I agree. It is the Western response, the global response, has been much too slow and incremental.
Mhm,
So, I mean,
mhm,
I cannot even begin to defend that. Um,
mhm,
the only positive thing I can say is that there is movement now. Even among governments that have historically been strong backers of Israel. Even Trump is clearly distancing himself from Netanyahu. So we're not yet at the stage where the global pressure is sufficient to get Netanyahu to stop. But I don't think we're far from it. I mean, Israel has become a pariah state. It is, isolated at this stage from pretty much everybody but the US government. And I would
mhm,
say that its relations with Washington are precarious. So,
mhm.
that's where we are. We have to keep pushing. This is not a hopeless situation. I mean, I know people are getting killed every single day. So, I
Yeah,
really don't want to belittle that. But I think we got to keep pushing because I do think we're nearing the point where
yeah.
Netanyahu is so isolated that he can't but capitulate to these demands of decency and have a ceasefire and allow the food in, and and then I think the next step is then to push finally for a Palestinian state to stop buying into this endless non-existent peace process and to really force the government, the Israeli government, to accept that this one state reality, this endless apartheid, is not the solution. Mass deportation of Palestinians is not the solution. The only viable solution is two states living side by side.
Ken, I want to ask you a bit about Human Rights Watch, but I also want to start by saying, as a journalist, I've worked with many people at Human Rights Watch in many different capacities. And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was quite small when you joined, when you were there. I mean, you made it global in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm curious if is my perception that a strategy of shaming governments is somehow central to what HRW does. I mean, I don't want to
No, no,
reduce it to that.
no. I think you're right. I mean, look, I describe in the book there, in essence, are two things that Human Rights Watch does. One is that we do shame governments. And the reason we're able to do that is because in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights just as a matter of basic legitimacy. I mean, it's a way
Mhm,
of saying, we look out for our people and not just ourselves. And so when they fall short, when Human Rights Watch investigators are able to document how they are in fact not living up to this pretense, it's embarrassing. It's shameful. It delegitimizes them. And they hate it. They attack us, but ultimately they realize they're not going to get rid of the bad press we're able to generate without changing the bad conduct. And so that's a very powerful tool. The other thing we
mhm,
do, which people I think appreciate less, and I describe many examples of this in the book, is that we go to influential governments that purport to support human rights in their foreign policy. And we say, look, this is the way you can force the target to change. They want something from you, an arms sale, they want a trade package, they want an invitation to a summit, whatever it is, don't give it to them until they change. And that's a 1-2 punch that works a lot. I mean, it doesn't work every single time. It often doesn't work definitively. It works for a while and then things retrench. But it is a very powerful combination. And one of the reason I wrote the book is I wanted to show how powerful it is, to show that this is not, just pie in the sky stuff. that we're able to move the most powerful governments on incredibly difficult issues, including the US government, including China, including Russia, by using these techniques.
Uh, Speaking of moving governments, as a journalist, as a Palestinian, watching Israel kill more than 217 journalists, targeting and killing their families, more than 1,000 members of each of their families, it's undeniable to me that that's deliberate. But what shocks me still is sort of the silence in the political, but particularly in the media establishment in the West. It seems strange that it's only the Al Jazeera's and a handful of others that seem to want to try to use that to move people to, if not stop that, stop the genocide. Why do you think Israel is doing that, and why has it not elicited a greater response from member states, but also from media
Yeah.
organizations?
Well, I mean, first, the effect of that is that we know less about what's going on in Gaza.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that, awful as we know it is, it's even worse. And as we learn more, if we get to the point where journalists can roam freely, people are going to be appalled. Now, why are Western journalists not denouncing this more? I think it's because it's so difficult to prove that these are targeted killings. And I actually think that that's a little bit beside the point at this stage, because maybe they are targeted killings. Maybe this is just the way Israel's fighting, and maybe there is such indifference to Palestinian civilian lives that through their indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, this is just, one slice of
Hmm.
life, 200 plus journalists, but, everybody else is losing. Every other profession is losing too. And I think this may just be indicative of the widespread killing in Gaza. So either way, it's horrible. Either way, it should be denounced. And it's why is it not more? I think that. You know,
Uh,
Go ahead. Yeah.
well, sorry, no, I don't want to cut you off. Please
Yeah.
finish it.
No, no, I mean, I just, I don't. I mean, sometimes media, New York Times, BBC, become
Hmm.
very sensitive to criticisms from pro-Israel critics.
Hmm.
There's kind of an overemphasis, tendency to bend over backwards there, present both
Hmm.
sides when there really aren't both sides,
Yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Part of it is it's also difficult to know exactly what's happening. I mean, I wrote a piece just a year ago for the New York Review of Books, you know,
Yes.
um, crimes of war in Gaza, where I
Hmm.
really tried to take on all the Israeli defenses. So is Hamas using human shields? What about the? I went through, what about the warnings they're giving? I kind of went through every single Israeli defense and then showed
Hmm.
why it didn't justify what the Israeli army was doing.
Right, right.
But that, I was able to do that because I've actually had a lot of experience applying international humanitarian law. I've operated in war zones, but that kind of analysis is not simple for an ordinary journalist to do. And so I think there's a tendency just to say, well, the Palestinians say X number of people died, but Israel says Hamas is doing something wrong.
Right,
You
right,
know,
right. Yeah, create doubt. Well, what I was gonna there was a poll, I think today or yesterday, by Hebrew University. It was reported in Haaretz. 64% of Israelis see no need for more reporting on Palestinians in Gaza, and believe, quote, there are no innocent people in Gaza. Right. So 64%. Let's assume that's true. Does that surprise you? And how big of a how big of a barrier does that create for stopping not only the genocide but ever having a form of peace, or in the Middle East and Israel and
no, I
Palestine?
mean, I think it's appalling that the Israeli public has been so supportive of this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And, it's not just attributable to the trauma of October 7th, 2023. It's I think at this stage, it's a product of almost deliberate ignorance. They don't want to know. They don't want more reporting on it because they don't want to know. You know, and it's just whatever it takes to protect me and just do it. You saw something similar in the United States after 9/11, where people didn't want to hear about the torture. Just do whatever it takes to protect them. Send people to Guantanamo, put them in CIA secret detention,
Hmm.
whatever. Don't tell me. Just do it. You know, and I think something similar is going on in Israel. I as I think through what's the most likely way to stop these atrocities, I don't think through changing Israeli public opinion. I actually think that it's going to be through external pressure, primarily through Washington. That this can't continue without U.S. support, and I think it's more possible to change that U.S. support than it is to change Israeli public opinion at this stage.
It's just crazy. Well, listen, this has been great. I do have just one or two more questions, one particularly about the book. But before I get to that, it's rare to have a chance to speak to someone who's spent so much of their career going after, or so much time, I should say, and so much work put into going toe to toe, let's say, with many different kinds of regimes that are, very, guilty of violating human rights on a massive level. Well, whether Putin, whether Saddam, whether, I mean, is there a particular victory or, let's say, experience through your work, through your career, that you think you learned something that could inform how we navigate this moment when it comes to Gaza, but also the broader sort of, as you said, people spilling into the streets really all over the world for many similar and not dissimilar
Yeah.
reasons?
Well, I mean, it's hard to answer that with a simple example, but I mean, let me cite three things. I mean, one is, as you note, people talk often about this contest between autocracy and democracy, and
Hmm.
say, "Oh, the autocrats are winning."
Right.
And that actually seems to be true in the West. It's not true in the rest of the world, where we've
Okay.
seen these huge protests against autocracy in country after country, and sometimes big success, getting rid of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, getting
True.
rid of the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka, getting rid of
True.
Bolsonaro in Brazil, or the Law and Justice Party in Poland, stopping the coup in South Korea. So, there's a lot there to be positive about, because people, when they live under autocracy, when they see the self-serving nature of that rule, they want out. They want an accountable government. So I take a lot of solace from that. Another thing I've seen, and this was epitomized by how we got the treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, where we share the Nobel Peace Prize, but also how we got the International Criminal Court, is that the mere
Mhm.
fact that the superpowers are against you doesn't mean you lose.
Right.
That in both of those cases, we were opposed by Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and we won nonetheless, because we put together a coalition of 60 small and medium sized governments that together had the moral and political clout to stand up to the superpower. And that's why we have an international criminal court today. Washington hated it. They still hate it. But we got it because Washington couldn't control everything. And so, that teaches me the importance of building coalitions to defend human rights. And then when it comes to particular cases, I mean, I opened the book with the example of
Right.
Idlib, where Idlib was
Mhm.
seen as a hopeless situation in terms of shaming, because Assad was unshameable. He was bombing hospitals and schools and marketplaces every day in Idlib. This
Mhm.
is the last part of Syria held by the armed opposition. And we decided to target Putin, who still at that point, before the full scale invasion of Ukraine, cared about his reputation. And for a couple of years, working really with Merkel, Macron, and Erdogan, we got the German, the French, and the Turkish governments to pressure Putin until in March 2020, the bombing stopped. He agreed. And it stopped completely for 3 years. It picked up a little bit, but then, Idlib is where the HTS came from that overthrew Assad and is now running Syria. So, that's just one example, but it's a very powerful one, because it shows that, even when shaming is hard, there are ways you can put pressure on governments that force them to change, and you can save many, many people's lives that way.
Can When this episode ends, for those who are listening, and they sort of reflect with what you've said, is there an idea or an action? I know it's hard to boil it down to one, but that you really hope they all carry forward in their lives.
Well, let me say one thing, Ahmed, because what we've been describing is sort of what I did at Human Rights Watch, kind of the
Mhm.
strategies of human rights groups. But I think it's important to stress that the way we're able to get anything done is
Mhm.
basically by reflecting a government's conduct
Mhm.
against the backdrop of public opinion, the public sense of right and wrong. If we spotlight governmental conduct and people look at that and say, that's not so bad, we don't get anything done, you know. But if people look at it and say that's outrageous, that's when we can begin to move the government. That depends on this public sense of right and wrong, which is not fixed. It's malleable, it's shaped. And if you think about just ourselves, how do you develop who you are? How do you develop what you think is right and wrong? It's, it's not so much through distant institutions, it's through your friends, your acquaintances, the people who have most influence in your life, your family. And so I think that every one of us has a responsibility to build that moral framework, and not to do it in some grandiose sense, but just to talk about these issues with your friends and your family, or your workplace acquaintances, But that basic building of public morality, of what is right and what is wrong, is the foundation on which the defense of human rights depends.
I love how you put that. Well, Ken, I want to thank you for your clarity, for your time, for your compassion, for your work, and also for showing us and reminding us that speaking truth to power still matters, always matters. And to everyone listening, stay curious, stay courageous, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you so much, Ken. Honestly, it's great.